because this one's kind of a doozy, but it's a good one. Then we'll talk about the secret society that really plays a big role in the lives we lead today. A mogul magnet, 1902. Man in search of a giant lodestone in Alaska. The ship's mission. I don't want to give it all away, so let's jump in. After the explosion of the giant powder mills in Alabama, a party of northern capitalists purchased the dividends and determined to erect an other factory upon the ill-fated spot where for every year for 12 years the mill had exploded, causing terrific loss and many deaths. The president of the company requested that I should visit Pittsburgh in search of a magnet endowed with sufficient power to attract an object of friction at a distance of 50 feet. Fortunately, while prospecting through the North and Alaska, I formed the acquaintance of Captain Lawrence, late of the Pacific Steam Whaling Company, who kindly informed me that along the Yukon Delta there existed a peculiar lodestone of wonderful magnetism. To me, this information was invaluable, and I accordingly accepted his invitation to join the whalers, who were soon to leave on an expedition from Point Barrow. I was a little dubious of the adventure, in spite of the promising report of the Delta. For 10 years previous, my brother Jim, my only surviving relative, sailed from Point Barrow with Bob Lawrence, a brother of our captain. Wild fellows they were, too, and the result was the wreck of the revenue cutter and 4 whaling vessels. 900 men became castaways and eventually perished from hunger and long exposure on the sterile coast of Greenland. Our voyage was replete with events thrilling and dangerous, and in my enthusiasm for the whaling business, I quite forgot my lodestone mission when it was brought to bear upon my mind in thoroughly disagreeable way. The captain and I were together on the deck discussing the possibility of making our return down the Yukon River, thus passing through the gold fields and lodestone ore, when the engineering crew appeared to be before us, and an announcement that the machinery in the power room refused to work. None of the engineers could explain this mystery. It really seemed inexplicable. Soon the steam died away, but strange, the vessel's speed increased and began registering as high as 270 knots per hour. Okay, we're dealing with a large whaling vessel that is now lost all machinery, no power, everything's refusing to work. The vessel's speed has increased, so the engines aren't even working, and the boat is going 270 knots per hour. Now, that's absolutely terrifying. It was indeed a ship at sea. What direction we were going, it was impossible to tell, for the compass didn't show. But with a glass, I saw at a distance a mountain of dark color, and the secret of our speed was revealed. We were within the precincts of the great Lodestone Mountain, that both the explorers, Ross and Franklin, believed to be near the pole, surrounded by waters, presumably unnavigable. I knew that when we arrived within a certain distance, the attraction of the mogul magnet would be so powerful that the vessel would be crushed into pieces against it. A hasty examination was made of the vessel, and nothing could be done to avoid the disastrous landing, for the hull was of heavy iron, of the ordinary build, with fastenings of steel. We therefore thought no more of the vessel's safety, but of how to avoid death shock, which most assuredly would come to us all. Necessity was the mother of invention in this case. An avenue of escape was suggested by a British sailor, who through fear had already suspended himself 3 feet above the floor by catching to a rubber strap that hung from the ceiling. Within half an hour we had a strap each and were dangling in the mid-air when the crash came. It was a crash indeed, for one side of the vessel was firmly embedded in the adamant. With the exception of Good, who sustained a slight shock, every man aligned on the mountain bank unhurt. So this magnetic mountain grabbed this steel whaling vessel and dragged it through the ocean at 270 knots per hour. We succeeded in reaching the top of the mountain where millions of grouse, so they're marooned on this island now. They've climbed to the top of the mountain. We succeeded in reaching the top of the mountain where millions of grouse flew gaily enough around. So when you study the lodestone, you'll find Interesting things about animals circling it. I'm sure some of you have seen some of those images that have kind of gone viral recently about that. And I've touched on the lodestone and the worship stone and the living deity that is the lodestone, and the Mecca and Kaaba and the circling of the stone. Where was I? And I, in advance of the party, stopped to rub my eyes as well as I might. There, not 20 yards in front, placed in a charming situation under a group of overhanging cliffs, was the cozy habitation of a cliff dweller. So they're on this lodestone island and they find a habitation of some kind. What the dickens, exclaimed I, can this be a mountain of cliff dwellers? Even as I said it, from an aperture in the rock, there limped out a Rip Van Winkle looking fellow, clothed in a beautiful cloak of duck breast, and with a glorious crown of white locks. I thought I must have got a touch of the sun. How did he ever get here? Besides, he was alone, for he could easily see all over the mountain. I stared, and so did the other men. And just as the instant the captain came up from the rear. Here, Cap, said I, is that a white man or a North Pole Josh? Then all of a sudden the white haired man gave a cry and came nobbling towards me. When he got close, he fell down in a sort of faint. With a spring, I was by his side. Great powers! It was my brother Jim. So remember, his brother Jim, on a whaling expedition from Greenland towards the Yukon, had crashed, and they hadn't heard from him, figured him dead. At the sound of the disturbance, another figure, also clad in sealskin, emerges from the cliffs and came running towards us. On seeing the captain, he too gave a cry. Cap, he hollowed, do you know me, Bob, your brother? And he fell at his kinsman's feet and rolled over and over, weeping in joy. 10 years ago, Lawrence and I were hurled against this mountain. The ship and the other 13 men went into the deep. Since then, we too have lived like a second Robinson Crusoe and his man, Friday, hoping against hope that some explorers might help us away. But none ever came. And now you, of all people on earth, turn up and find us where you least expected. Wonderful and most merciful, too. In a joyful manner, we all set to talking, relating the main features of our many adventures, till exhausted from the long exposure we fell asleep. For here no day nor light came, yet the world around us was mellowed with the delicate rays of the aurora borealis. The preparations for our return voyage were arduous. From the wreck of our vessel, we secured a sufficient quantity of timbers to build a boat, in which we conveyed ourselves safely to the port of Newark, thence to Uncle Sam's icebox, rich in the knowledge of the great fortune that lay await in our return, the mogul magnet of the earth. But life is short at best, and if some ship other than iron, side whaling vessel is not secured, I shall not risk the magnetism of the wonderful lodestone again. Truth is often stranger than fiction. So yeah, that's a crazy one. Thanks for bearing with me there, guys. That was a long read.